Hey traders, welcome back to the weekly Forex Forecast. Coming into this week, we have the US dollar still sitting number one in the ranking system. And this is the main theme that I'm going to be looking at heading into next week, dollar long plays. You can see all the way back on the 12th, we did start to see abnormal bullish sentiment coming into the dollar over the daily time horizon. Essentially what this does is this tells you with a 68-70% chance that this asset is set to pause or consolidate. And you can see after we got the 12th, we did try to push a bit higher, but like an elastic band, it just holds, and we get the consolidation. And now that sentiment has washed out. So going into this week, I do really like the US dollar. If we zoom in a little bit here, you can see that we have two major breakout levels. One we've already broken with momentum, and look how strong this is. Momentum precedes price, so I am looking for further advances. And there is a high probability that we come up to the 107.35. Now, when we come up to the 107.35, this is also, just as this was the start of a potential third wave. And I'm not a big wave fan, but you can see when you get this failure to make a low, we break through. Look at the momentum. This tells you all of the shorts who had stop losses in this area, they capitulated, and we see new breakout traders coming in. You get this momentum. I think we are also going to see the same above the 107. Perhaps we test it first, just like we did over here, and we get more sellers trying to sell it off. But if we break through here, expect this to break with momentum, and this actually kickstarts a major reversal. This being a bigger one wave and this a two wave, a major reversal in the dollar. So dollar long plays are absolutely my top go-to theme heading into next week. And we are also seeing a general overall risk off regime coming back into markets. So that is something we're also going to consider when choosing markets to trade in today's video. Okay, so let's have a look at the scores for the coming week, and you can see the dollar is the number one theme heading into next week. This is what should be focused on heading into next week, dollar long plays, and we are going to be looking at a number of dollar long plays in today's video. Aside from that, the Canadian dollar sits at number two. This is supported by a stronger crude oil price, and what we're seeing here is when we have the US dollar and the Canadian dollar both strong, this is indicative of an inflationary regime. So I did say to you that a risk-off regime is taking hold. But it's an inflationary regime. It's an acceleration of inflation, not a deflationary recession regime just yet. I do believe there is a larger recession coming, but it's been held off quite successfully with strong fiscal policy in the US. And at the moment, it doesn't look like we're heading into a recession just yet. It is coming, but it's all about timing. And at the moment, it's an inflationary regime which seems to be kicking in, and that's the risk off we're seeing. In other words, yields have to go up because inflation is going up. And because inflation goes up, we see the US dollar follow yields higher, but we also see, the Canadian dollar with crude oil price going higher as well. Heading into this week, I do like the US dollar and the Canadian dollar to the upside. And alongside that, the New Zealand dollar is looking like the best short still, alongside the Aussie dollar. And I'm also going to be looking at the pound to the short side as well. So pound, Aussie, New Zealand versus the US dollar versus the Canadian dollar, definitely. And also, with that kind of risk-off tilt, we're going to be looking at the pound, the Aussie, and the New Zealand versus the Swiss franc. So what I'm going to be looking at in order is New Zealand, US dollar to the downside, Aussie, US dollar to the downside, pound dollar to the downside. We'll also look at euro dollar because we do this every week. We're also then going to be looking at New Zealand CAD to the downside, Aussie CAD to the downside, pound CAD to the downside. And we're finally going to look at New Zealand franc to the downside, Aussie franc to the downside, pound franc to the downside. Now, the yen is the best short, but we're getting very, very close to the area where we could see intervention. I mean, we're already in the area, above 152 you can see intervention pretty much at any time. However, don't forget Watanabe did say the 155 level is probably where we're going to start seeing intervention. We're very, very, very close to that now in US dollar Japanese yen. So 155 in US dollar Japanese yen, don't be surprised to see intervention come in. And if there is intervention, this will cause the yen to spike, hence why we've been filtering the Japanese yen as a short in recent videos, and I'm going to continue to do that again today. It's just not worth it on a short-term basis being on the wrong side of intervention in the Japanese yen. And the final thing to note is we do also have the Bank of Japan on Friday as well, so we may just see a pretty flat yen heading into Friday. That is really the only interest rate decision and the major piece of news we need to pay attention to. Other than the BOJ on Friday, pretty much again we have a clear run. There's some inflation data in there, but nothing we really need to plan for or trade around in terms of short-term trading next week. Okay, so let's have a look through the watch list, and starting with crude oil as always, we did get this big spike up on crude oil, and then we reversed this, and that was on the Israeli retaliation to Iran. And we seem to have pulled a little bit of fear out the markets just because there was a lot of anticipation around a potential Israeli retaliation. And Israel looks to have struck military bases around the nuclear facilities as a warning, rather than striking the facilities themselves, which would, of course, have been a much bigger escalation, and that is what the markets were scared of. So coming into this week, we have seen some of the power come out of crude oil because of this. However, on balance, I do still favor long plays. What I'm going to be looking for is one of two things. I'm looking for a continued pullback in crude oil, and if we start to break out intra-week, you can look for the breakout with momentum, breakout, pull back, or breakout like this, breakout, pull back, and look for the follow through into the upper bound here at the 85.60. And if we continue all the way back and we test the lower bound and we breach the 79.77, this is going to be the second place next week. I'm going to be looking for a potential long opportunity in crude oil for 1 or 2 days bounce to the upside. Okay, so moving on to the first Forex pair we're going to look at here is New Zealand dollar. This is my favorite play heading into next week. You can see we did have this high, we came down, we failed to make a high, and then we broke through, we pulled back, we retested, and now we've accelerated or re-accelerated to the downside. So this is a really good short coming into next week, not just technically, but also in the performance metrics. This is one of the top, in fact, the top short we should be looking at heading into next week. What I'd like to see then is, I'd like to see this market pull back, and if we can pull back, breach the 0.59580, and if we can come back and test this mini head and shoulders, you see this again, there's a head, we kind of failed to make the high over here, and we break through here. If we can pull back, breach the 0.5958 and retest this low, this is going to be a great place on the rip, kind of sell the rip opportunity to start to look for a 1 or 2 day reversal in New Zealand dollar. And alternatively, in fact, I mean, I look to hold the short term for 1 or 2 days, but with a lot of these, you can swing trade these. You can hold on to them for multiple days and look for the lower bound, you know, in multiple weeks. And certainly the dollar pairs do look like they have the potential to hold on to those a little bit, maybe heading into next week. So any pullback, I'm going to be looking for that. However, if we break out, if we're pulling back and we break out before we test the upper bound, you can also look for a pullback and a follow through down next week to the 0.5817. Next is Aussie dollar. Now, this is another really good looking short heading into next week. And again, you can see how we've broken out here below this low. And this low sits right below the upper bound at the 0.6494. Of course, we breached the upper bound. You know, you have a 70% chance roughly of pausing or reversing back inside. And the same is true to the downside. The difference is if you're doing this against the prevailing trend, you tend to have a slightly lower chance of that happening. And if you do it in line with the prevailing trend, like we're doing here, or with the strong and the weak currency, you actually have a greater than 68 or 70% chance of this pausing or reversing. So coming into this week, I do like Aussie US dollar shorts. What I'd like to see is I'd like to see this pull back and flag. And if we can pull back, and again, there's a key area of support, key area of resistance, or not an area, but it produces an area because we have an actual resistance and an actual price point of support. And it right in between that sits the 0.6494. So if we breach this area next week, this is going to be a great place to look for a sell the rip opportunity in Aussie dollar. And as always, if we start to make our way back towards this upper bound, but instead of testing it, we actually break out with momentum, you can look for that breakout trade. So there's two ways of trading. You can buy on the pullback, or you can sell on the pullback in this case, or you can buy or sell on the breakout. So you get the breakout, and then you get the follow through down to the 0.63425. Next is pound dollar. Now, if we look at this on a daily chart, you can see that we do have this range breakout, and this is a really nice setup because if this pulls back towards the 1.2481, especially if we breach this and we test the 1.2517, essentially we're overbought on the week, and we're testing a key area of previous broken support turning resistance. So if we drop down to the 4 hours, any pullback in this area, especially if we can breach the 1.2481 and test the 1.2517, it's going to be a great place to look for a near-term reversal to the downside in pound dollar next week. And as always, if we break out before we get there, if we start to make our way up and then we break out like this with momentum, you can look for that bear flag follow through into the 1.2260. Usually you only get one kind of bear flag on the 4 hours in a week. You don't tend to get more than that, you know, to the upside or the downside. And the fourth and final US dollar pair that we're going to look at in the Forex universe is euro dollar to the downside. Look at this every week, but this is actually a good opportunity heading into next week. And you can see there is a nice key area of support broken, potentially pulling back as an area of resistance. And it sits right underneath the upper bound heading into next week. So you can probably guess the setup that I'm looking at heading into next week in this asset is if we continue to pull back, and it does look like we need to pull back and correct, especially if we push through the 1.0724 and we start to breach the 1.0742, and there's a high over here as well. Anywhere above the 1.0742 is going to be a great place next week to start to look for a near-term reversal to the downside in euro dollar. And if we break out before that, maybe we test the 1.0724 and we can't get through it, then that would be the opportunity to look for that bear flag setup into the lower bound of the 1.0567. Okay, so moving on to the CAD pairs, starting with New Zealand CAD, you can see this market is trending very nicely to the downside. And so I only want to be short or do nothing. I cannot buy this market next week. New Zealand CAD is highlighted as one of the good shorts heading into next week in the hedge dash algorithms. Any pullback in this market, and I like the fact that we have prior low and we have a prior high sitting right by the upper bound. And as soon as we breach the 0.8166, the odds are for this market to pause or reverse lower. And that is going to be the area I'm going to be looking at potentially selling first and foremost. And if we start to break out intra-week and you get that bear flag breakout like this, very often you get the pullback and you can look for the follow through into the 0.8025. Next is Aussie CAD. Now again, I can either short this or do nothing. I cannot buy this next week. And what I'd like to see is, I'd like to see a retest of these lows here. It's actually this low, which tried to bounce and then failed. But we have a nice key area of broken support here. So any pullback, and this sits right at the upper bound of the 0.8898. If we breach this level, we're going to be looking at a near-term opportunity to short Aussie CAD next week. And as always, if we break out with momentum intra-week and we sell off and we consolidate and correct, that's the opportunity for an intra-week breakout trade down to the 0.8748. And the final CAD pair is Pound CAD. And look at this sell-off that we had at the end of last week. A big sell-off to the downside. And you can see this market was trending up, trending up, trending up. And now we've actually got this kind of head and shoulders where we fail to make a new high and we start to break lower. So it does look like there's plenty more downside in Pound CAD, which means going into next week, I only want to be short or doing nothing. I do not want to be buying this market. And in order to get short, what I want to see is I want to see the market pull back. I want to see the market breach the 1.7132. And this is going to be the area on a pullback. I'm going to be looking for a short-term trading opportunity to the downside in Pound CAD. And usually I hold those for 1, 2, maybe 3 days, it depends. But I'd really like to see those move straight away. And if we fail to get to the upper bound, you can also look for the breakout, sell off, and the kind of bear flag setup down to the 1.6881. Wrapping up the Forex markets then with the Swiss franc pair, starting with New Zealand franc. This is my favorite Swiss franc pair, and I can only be short or do nothing. Buying this is not an option. We had that big sell-off, that risk-off move coming into markets on Friday because of the Israeli retaliation against Iran. And I do think we're going to correct and reverse this somewhat. But going into next week, I can either be short or do nothing. I cannot buy this. So you can see there are nice lows over here. This low actually came down, tested, tried to bounce and failed. And so any pullback into the 0.5415 and in fact above it, because I want this to breach the upper bound. I want this to move outside of this range so I can have an opportunity to short for this to come back inside the range. But that's the opportunity I'm going to be looking at next week. And if we break out before we get there, you can also consider that kind of bear flag sell-off down to the 0.5306. So just as to the upside, if we breach the upper bound, I'm looking for a potential short because it should reverse back inside the range with a high degree of probability. So too to the downside, if you start to trade, if you get involved in a short and you start to trade below the 0.5306, that's a good opportunity to start to book your profits because you may just pause and go nowhere and even correct back a bit in these assets. Next is Aussie franc. Now I can either be short or do nothing. I cannot buy this. Again, you can see the big risk off move. And in fact, it's traded into its lower bound last week and the lower bound still held despite the risk off move. Now, coming into this week, I do think this is going to pause, correct, and we've started anew. You can see how we've broken out here. We're making high highs and high lows. Then we have this big sell-off and we finish with this kind of capitulation low. But it's just a near-term capitulation based on this one kind of sell off to the downside where we start making a few low lows and low highs. So any pullback in this asset, I would like to see this breach the 0.5902, and this is going to be an area above this level. I'm going to be looking at a potential short next week in Aussie franc. And if we start to break out before that and you get the momentum to the downside, you can look for the pullback and you can look for the sell-off into the 0.5785. And the final Forex pair we're going to look at is pound franc to the downside before we move on to gold and silver. And you see how pound franc in the daily we're looking at here was trending up, and we started to lack momentum. You get this kind of ending diagonal pattern where you're running out of momentum and then you get this big sell-off. And of course we had the risk off move to kind of finish that. So very much like the other franc pairs, I do think we're going to reverse this somewhat. But any kind of reversal in this market is just viewed as an opportunity to short at a better price. So if we come up and we breach the 1.1353, and you can see there's 1, 2, 3, there's plenty of highs up here that we can run into and start to roll over from. So this is going to be a short opportunity I'm looking at next week from above the 1.1353. And of course, as always, if we start to break out before we get there, very often you see a correction first because, you know, with the weekly candles, most of the time, you're going to get an upper wick anyway. So if you start to pull back and you start to get close to the 1.1353, but you don't quite get there, if it breaks out intra-week, you know, you can have both options. And in this case, you can short down to the 1.11708. So those are the two setups that I'm going to be looking at in all of these Forex pairs, but I cannot buy this market. I can only short this market next week. Okay, so wrapping up the video with gold and silver. Now, I do have a bullish bias on the dollar. However, gold and silver can still rise against the dollar because what you can see is both gold and silver essentially appreciating in value against the dollar, whilst the US dollar appreciates in value against other currencies. And we have actually been seeing all three of them rising together recently. So any pullback, and this is indicative actually of inflation. So money coming out of the dollar and going into, you know, hard money like silver or gold, but versus other fiat currencies actually outperforming. So any pullback in this market, I only still want to be long or doing nothing. I do not want to short gold going into next week. Any pullback below the 2338.93, and I'd like to see it breach this level and test maybe these lows. This would be a great place next week to look for a buy the dip opportunity, especially for 1 or 2 day short-term trade. And if we break out before we get there, we start to pull back and we break out intra-week, we get the breakout with momentum. Very good example here of a breakout with momentum and then a pullback and then a follow through. So if we start to break out, we get the pullback. You can look for the follow through into the 2445.82. Wrapping up the video with silver. Now, out of gold and silver, I actually prefer silver longs. So heading into next week, I can either buy this or do nothing. Any pullback in this asset, I'm going to be looking for a breach of the 27.47. There is a low here. Maybe we get to this low, although that would be quite a deep breach. So this low actually looks a bit better. Any breach of this level is going to be the opportunity to look for 1 or 2 day reversal to the upside in silver next week. And if we break out before we get there, we pull back and we break out with momentum, again, there's your breakout with momentum, there's your pullback, and there's your follow through to the upside. Any kind of breakout, pullback, you can look for a follow through into the prior high and also onto the 30.21. If you start to break above the 30.21, this is where you should, if you're short-term trading intra-week, you should look for a potential profit-taking opportunity. So that is it from me for today, guys. As always, I hope you enjoyed today's video, and if you did, why not consider joining us in the GMT training room each day where I look at the best markets as well as sharing real-time setups that I'm personally looking at trading with members as part of our GMT training program. Don't forget, you can also get a 2-week free trial to the cutting-edge hedge-trading app used in today's video by heading over to www.hedge-.com.